We spend our entire lives inside buildings, but how often do we stop to ask what they're actually saying about us? Some architects embrace modern architecture as a global language that emphasizes innovation. But other architects look to tradition as a source of cultural continuity. I'm Soraya Salam, and this is the Doha Debates podcast.
The modernist project is an ideological project. These architects arrived with corporate agenda.
Not every intervention which was done under the name of modernism was successful. I don't think anybody would claim that.
That is what has broken our economy. That is what has polluted and destroyed our environment.
Architecture is always a pursuit of an ideal, of building a better world.
Our debate today: what does the architecture around us say about who we are and who we want to become? Joining me today are four architects from all over the globe. Badisha Sinha, Associate Director of the world-renowned Zaha Hadid Architects in London. Lucian Steil, a professor at the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture. We also have the acclaimed architect Kamal Khan Mumtaz, who's a writer and educator based in Lahore, Pakistan, and Marwa Al-Sabuni, author of 2 books, including Building for Hope, which explores how cities might be rebuilt in the aftermath of conflict in Syria. We're having this conversation in Doha during the Earthness Summit. That's an annual conference focused on sustainability and building a more resilient future. So I can't think of a better time to be all together. You all bring such different perspectives. So just for those who are not in this world of architecture, if we talk about different schools of thought, say traditionalists versus modernists, what kind of architect are you not and why? Marwa?
I can't define myself either a traditionalist or a modernist. I think both opposing views are a result of this discontinuity that took place in the aftermath of the World War I and II. And it places us in a place of a dilemma, actually, asking the question, in which style should we be building?
Lucian? What are you not?
I'm not a modernist. I'm not a traditionalist, but I am a traditional architect who is pretty open to the modern world, because I think that modernism is not modern. The modernism is in some way caricature of modernity, because modernity means just being in the world and acknowledging the fact that we are here now. And tradition doesn't mean that you have to necessarily replicate what has been done in the past, but that you kind of just take the best and the things which work really well, which were useful to make good places. And so, and I really, I'm really interested in that. I'm really interested in making places where people kind of find their way, people recognize, which doesn't mean that they have to just look exactly the same the way they have been, but just using the wisdom which we have from previous periods and, just kind of building on that. So and also I think that, that's something I'm really interested in, this idea of self. The self is not a static thing, it's something which evolves. And so evolves also the way we kind of think about the world. So we kind of, I consider myself also a learner. I kind of just really... And that's why I'm very delighted to be here, because I'm always meeting people, learning, and even kind of learning from people I don't necessarily like the work they do. Mm-hmm. And I found out that sometimes seeing or visiting places I thought I wouldn't like, I started liking it.
Okay.
So I'm kind of pretty open-minded.
Open-minded, okay. Kamal, what are you not and why?
Well, very clearly, I'm not a modern architect. This is not because I'm actually trained as a modern architect, but there's very conscious rejection and turning away from modernism. And I know a lot of people spontaneously would define my work as Islamic or Mughal architecture, but it's not about style. I consider myself, or maybe a better description of what we do is traditional. I am a traditionalist, and for me, these two represent two diametrically opposed worldviews. So I'm very clear about what I'm not and what I am.
Vidisha?
Well, I definitely don't think I'm from any of the isms which are talked about. I would say I define myself as someone who's contemporary. And I have a very strong respect for heritage. I think we can learn. Contextual is important, but I would not say I'm a traditionalist for sure. I like the idea that every new problem that comes to us, even if it has existed before, we have the freedom to see whether there's a new way in which it can be resolved. I don't necessarily think we have to follow what has been done before. Of course, if it is extremely successful, don't reinvent the wheel. That's okay. But I'm not very reverential in that sense of the word.
But in real terms, the kind of modern architecture you would design versus someone like Kamel, explain that. What's the big difference between modern architecture and traditional architecture?
That's an extremely broad question. I think we can all discuss it all day. But for me, if we take it down to its basic, I think there is not that much of a difference visually, yes, the way people perceive it because of the use of stylistic motifs, yes. But architecture from the time that we've started shaping space has been there to resolve issues for people. Now, fundamentally, what we call modern architecture today is what was seen as something which came into being post the war, 19th century, industrialization, and there was this complete shift towards finding new ways to do things, and also a conscious break from the past, because there was this idea of nation building globally for various reasons. And we can argue whether it was implemented successfully, for example, in the global south. Some of it, yes, you can argue not. But I don't think there's a fundamental difference in modern architecture and traditional architecture, other than the fact that it is very stylistically different. But we are both trying to solve problems, first and foremost. And for me, modern architecture, it frees me from the need to follow a formula or a routine or a certain established way of doing things, and allows me to ask the question fresh every time. And I think that's the big difference.
Well, may I jump in here? I guess modernism is now charged with many faults, of creating more problems than actually solving problems for people, and hence the need for this debate, because the modern project was actually a marketing project. It was introduced in order to revolt over the old system of class, abolish the class system that used to overrule in Europe and led to the Great Wars. And in place, there was a need for compensation. There was a need for a mega project that will compensate those losses economically, unfortunately. And the product of this revolution was architecture, basically, was to reshape our cities, to reshape our villages as well, and to reshape our societies into fragmented societies, first and foremost. I mean, in Paris, for example, in France, the Haussmann principles were introduced in order to thin out the urban fabric, in order to create this boulevard city that everything was seen by the power, by the government, by the ruling class, and so everyone was under the watchful eye of power, and that had continued as a project for modern architecture, as a project to dominate the lives of societies and to fragment the societies.
I would disagree, but I would totally completely disagree, because if you think back in time, when we start saying words like traditional or vernacular, a lot of us come from very feudal societies. There was a lot of discrimination, there was a lot of hierarchy, and a lot of hierarchy is expressed through the built environment. So you had the idea that you had a tenement versus a palace. There were gradations. So, I mean, whether we like it or not, I think now the world is much smaller and we know of each other's problems and we talk about it more freely. But it is not that it is a product of modernism. Modernism as we know it, yes, I agree, was defined at a point, like we said, where we were revolting from things which had gone wrong, so obviously globally. But if we dig back, I don't think the problem is coming from modernism, but fundamentally our social structures were always hierarchical. And architecture has played a role in establishing that kind of differentiation. So,
In what way?
well, architecture, whether you talk about power, whether you talk about, I was in Jordan, in Petra. Beautiful. It's so, and, especially in the week where we're talking about sustainability here, you see how they manage water. And you walk in and you see the caves and then suddenly you see columns, and the Romans were here. And there are these big, wide roads. And it was done to establish power because they had come in and they had invaded. So I think it goes back really, really long, this idea of creating segregation to establish power and dominance. I don't think that is only a result of modern architecture or our current world.
Well, I think there are plenty of things
this-
to clarify, but let's give
No,
the
go
floor
ahead,
to
please.
Lynn.
Then Lucian can jump in.
Well, I think I have two problems with this logic, because the word "we" is one thing. I mean, when you say "we," it means the global world, right? And I think we have problems are different between the different regions of the world. So the feudalism, for example, is a Western problem versus the Muslim world, where feudalism didn't actually exist in the sense of hierarchy and social hierarchy and ownership, because the definition of property is quite different in Islamic law.
How do you explain feudalism just for our audience?
So feudalism is you have a class that owns large tracts of land, and those classes deploy labor in those lands, and economically they exploit the labor and exploit the products and crops of those lands. When you compare this reality with the Muslim reality, there is no such thing of exploitation here, because there is a percentage that goes back. It's the quarter. The labor who works in the land, they are granted by Islamic law a quarter of the crops, and that guarantees that their rights in that terms. And also there is the property classification is quite different, because we don't have nobles in Islam. We don't have this class hierarchy, social hierarchy. The lands, it's either owned by the state, which is the miri land. The miri land means that you have a right to work and inherit this land. You can pass it for the prosperity. You pass it to your own generations, and that created a continuous cultivation of land, and also work against the creation of feudalism. So that, in one sense, modernism was a solution for the problems of the West, but it was imposed on the Muslim world, creating a series of problems, not only in the Muslim world, in my view, but also globally in the West, as we see now in the alienation that is created in the Western city.
Lucian?
Yeah, so interesting, all these points. I understand what you are saying about Haussmann, and also so I agree also with what you're saying. So in some way, when you look at the Baroque city, for example, you have very clearly an expression of power, and when you look at the papal cities, you have all these kind of dominant axes and organization perspectives which are in some way organized. And I'm sure that exists also in some way. So I'm not really familiar that much with the Islamic city, but this the Islamic city also had like power structures, and the power structures is always expressed, and that can be religious powers or civic powers. And I'm not saying that, and often the expression of civic authorities or religious authority is not something which is necessarily harmful. But again, I don't want to kind of go too much into that. Something I really want to say also, like the feudal society, the cities, the traditional European city was also a reaction to the feudal system, because it allows, the cities became places of freedom. So the people, when they went from a feudal, people were even fleeing from feudal oppression. In the city, they had freedom. And the cities were bastions of freedom. And they had, even in the 12th century in Italy, you had like systems which were pretty like proto-democratical, where people decided about the future. It didn't last very long. But overall, you always, I think, had this kind of coexistence of a structural, kind of power structure, and a kind of popular, vernacular kind of system, which were kind of in some way negotiating their place in the city. And that's, I think, also why traditional cities are really still good places to be, and they have accommodated over time various societies, this modernist or not modernist, it doesn't really.
Let's talk about that.
I really wanted to say one thing, because I think one thing which I find very crucial, because I also know modernism, the Bauhaus, when you look at the Bauhaus was really an idealistical project which was kind of trying to resolve some of the social injustices, creating affordable housing, creating, and then also bringing together craftsmanship, industry, and artists to create a more beautiful world. And that's something which can be understood when you look at the production of 19th century, the kind of historicism, and in some way an accelerating production of kitsch, which kind of led to this reaction, and people started to. But something I find is, for me, what really I find is one major issue with tradition and modernism is the fact that tradition is still relying on craftsmanship, on the hands, on the human kind of intelligence, whereas modernism is has gone a far way into empowering digital and artificial intelligence, where at some point we architects can produce buildings and environments which we cannot imagine humanly. Mm-hmm. It's mostly machine or artificial intelligence design. And that creates an incredible problem to me.
Cameron?
Well, I think since we're going to get into this debate, and we want to really do that, take a deep dive into this, I think the first prerequisite is to clarify the terms that we use. Right here around the table, each of us have our own perspectives, historical lived experiences, etc. And they will always give a host of variety of expressions, manifestations of these things that we use, like feudalism or modernism, etc. So what I would like to do is to propose the following definitions. You may not agree with that, and we can talk about it. Because what we need to have now, especially in this world today, you see, it was all right to have a debate like this 100 years ago, because there was unquestionably there was a global domination of the Eurocentric perspective. But I think today, with communications as they are opening up, and it is, we need to take a broader view of things and try to see beyond the local differences. Is there a general phenomenon here? Is there a general picture globally? I mean, a lot of what we'll be saying automatically, all of our backgrounds, education, will be predominantly the Eurocentric point of view, but there is the Islamic position, there is the Indocentric perspective, there's the Sinocentric perspective, there is the perspective of pre-agrarian societies, the Amazon, and so on. So can I attempt or dare to suggest a larger framework for looking at these things? So let me try. First of all, modernism and tradition are terms which represent two worldviews. And secondly, terms like feudalism, etc. Also, there is a larger picture of the human history, which, let me just try and put it in perspective. Humanity has been around for 300,000 years, and some would say longer, even 1 million or 2 million, or some say 3 million, but at least 300,000 years. And we take for granted that what are the criteria and norms for us now in the 21st century are unquestionably universal, eternal values. They're not. This is a culture, a time which represents a very, very, very tiny moment in human history. So the normal, natural condition, and let's say that the central criterion determining these changes in worldviews, as well as our interaction with the environment and the results that we are now, which is why we're having this kind of discussion, is the economy. That is how we relate and interact with our environment. So, first of all, let us be clear about what is normality, what is the normal condition. And I know we don't even now, we deny that there is any norm. We talk about the new norm. People surprised and say, what do you mean norm? There is no norm, it changes. Well, consider that for 300,000 years, we had a natural economy. That is, we obtained all we needed from nature directly. And we gave back everything that we extracted, and it was recycled. There was no damage to the environment, and there was perfect harmony and balance between what we extracted and what we gave back. So, or consider the fact that as living organisms, all living organisms must interact with the environment. And in order to sustain life, constantly we monitor deviations from the norm. And as I said, the norm is the perfect balance between what we take and what we give.
But Dr. Kamel, may I say something here? Are you talking about the history of humanity?
Indeed, I am.
Well, I have to disagree here because there are moments in history where, there has been a whole, collapse of empires and a whole destruction of complete societies, and
That's right.
that must be for the lack of balance that you are describing.
Yes, you're absolutely right. When did this lack of balance arise? When did empires arise?
Throughout that history.
Not throughout. It happened precisely between 5 to 10,000 years ago.
I guess what I want to say here is that humans have this tendency of, moving towards tyranny, and like you are describing, overusing abundance, and shift that towards towards an elitist class where they could, play a monopoly over that, and that's when you have this misbalance. But if we will go back to the question of traditionalism and modernism, perhaps we shouldn't, creating this binary between the whole human history and this moment of time.
Exactly. When did these classes arise? When did these... it is not always that humans had this idea. Always, if that's, I would say, 23 hours, if it was a 24-hour day of our lives on Earth. It's only in the last hour. And that precisely is with the agrarian revolution, the change in the economy shifting from a hunting and gathering society in which there was no concept of my land, my animal,
So with the
my
arrival
property.
of civilization, you mean?
That is precisely the moment that we have settlements, villages, markets, cities. That is why we have the word civilization, urbanization, precisely between 5,000 to 9 or 10,000 years ago.
So I want to get Badisha in because I see you taking notes. Would you say modern architecture is a break with history?
I don't think so, because for me, the modern of today is the history of tomorrow. At any given point in time, as Camille is saying, that point in time, the today, is modern because it is. And I do think that we have evolved. It's not been linear. It's been a non-linear evolution. But for me, modern is the today, and tradition is the yesterday. And we are all looking towards the future. Now, what we are probably debating is that moment when what we classify as modern architecture. And I think we do, and I will use the we. Yes, I practice in the Western Hemisphere, but my ethnicity and background gives me some exposure to the global South of what has happened. But the idea, I think we use broad brush to generalize too much. Not every intervention which was done under the name of modernism was successful. I don't think anybody would claim that. But it's okay to have made mistakes and to learn and to move on. So for me, yes, Lucy.
Oh, no, go, you're finished.
No. So I was just saying that I find it a little bit difficult to do a very black and white discussion on this, because for me, modern architecture is a continuing process. And modernism was maybe a moment in that.
Yeah, I'd like to understand, what purpose do you all think architecture should serve? Because I think we're talking about a few competing motivating factors here.
Could I just follow up on all of these three kind
Please.
of things? So, what bothers me a little bit is this kind of little bit big, mega picture about, thousands of years of history. And I think there is one thing which is, I think, very important, is that despite of what you said, there have been collapses, and the world has never been a perfect place. And you have dark ages throughout the history where everything was erased, everything went away. And then you have classic moments. You have moments of revivals, renaissances, not only in the Euro world, but everywhere. But I think what's unique today, there is like this, we cross the threshold where what you said, this balance is really threatened to a point where we kind of really thinking about the end. We're kind of thinking about the collapse, which is not reversible, because all the collapses we had before were still in some way, I mean, I don't want to be ridiculous, but sustainable. There was still a way to come back and to rebuild, but now we are in the threshold of an ecological collapse.
So when you say this balance, you're talking about environmentally. Is that what we're talking about here?
Environmental, because it's also cultural. It's an environmental culture, because I think if we're in this situation, it's not only economy. I think the economy is one thing. The economy actually, in the classical way, the economy is like the way of managing wisely the resources. The economy is not as such a negative thing, because people have to serve.
But if I can just jump back into the question you asked, what is the relevance of architecture? I mean, architecture, like it or not, is a tertiary service. It's a service we provide. We are given the opportunity when someone has a need and the resources to interpret, and what I call is like if you imagine something, you dream something, you have a need, I'll make it real. Now, those dreams are different, those narratives are different, and at different points in time, different architects have catered to those needs differently. So for me, architecture fundamentally is still a tertiary service sector. It's a service that we are providing society. And a bit like food and shelter and everything, once the basic is taken care of, it gets pushed to high art. Now and it exists in grades. So I think it is also important to contextualize when we say modern architecture and has it failed us. What are we talking about? Are we talking about large public housing? Are we talking about the iconic buildings which have regenerated a township? There are success stories and there are failures. So I do think we have to be a little more objective, because otherwise we can be here till midnight.
Yeah, okay.
What are the needs of today then? What needs should architecture serve today?
Yeah. Well, first of all, architecture is, everyone knows, the art of building. So that's actually two things. One is a material, physical, technological enterprise, and the other is art. So we have to be very clear about this. And if you really want to discuss these issues, you have to distinguish between these two. They are very closely interconnected. So there is the functional material shaping of the environment, essentially to meet our requirements, our needs for shelter and comfort and environmental protection. That's the technical material aspect of it. But there is an art aspect. What is art? Then the question is, what is art at all? And let's say in very briefly that it is about communication, and communication in particular of what is real, what is the reality. That is the special capacity of the artist to be able to penetrate beyond surface appearance and to inform us about what is the essential reality. So that brings us to the narrative. So architecture has a functional, material, technological aspect which changes, and it gives rise to different worldviews as well. But there is the narrative, there is a dominant narrative. And again, I'll get back to this point that yes, there are so many varieties of manifestations of these things. I mean, anything, art, there is no one manifestation of art. But we can agree on what is a universal purpose, a function, a definition of art.
What would the dominant narrative be today?
Yes.
Like, what is modern architecture communicating about the dominant narrative in our ideologies
exactly.
today?
This is exactly why I began to give that rather long story.
Yes. But I would love to hear specifically.
So let me put it in terms of the dominant narrative. For most of human existence, the dominant narrative was being in being made in the image of the divine.
Westernly.
Pardon?
In the Western Hemisphere.
In the Western Hemisphere, yes.
Christian
in
art.
America and the Amazon
Yes.
West, yes.
No, in
Before
the
the white man arrived, this was the dominant worldview.
I mean, being created in the image of God is a Christian
All right, that's
notion.
a particular formulation from the Eurocentric point of view, but the dominant paradigm was the presence of the divine. All the creational myths, the creational
Yeah, I'm
stories.
with you on spiritual worldview that it's
Yeah, so
completely right
that's-
that you have the
yeah.
spiritual
Yeah.
worldview that is, the formulating factor of the art of
Yeah,
the great civilizations or the empires. But I mean, being created in the image of God and
Okay, I'm using a
manifesting-
biblical term.
Yeah.
So let's say the dominant worldview was that this is a created universe.
But it differs from the Islamic worldview, for example, versus
The differences will be
the
Islam,
classical-
we're talking about pre-Islamic. We're talking about pre-agrarian revolution. We're talking about pre-feudal. All of the religions were revealed within the civilizational period.
If you allow me here,
Please expand, yeah, because
Yeah.
what do you mean by you don't think Islamic architecture is connected to the divine and
No, it's
reverence to the
connected
divine?
to the divine. It's not a manifestation of the image of the divine. So we don't
No.
have an
All right.
image of the divine to represent in our
No,
arts.
I will
We have
withdraw my
But what about the
use.
99
No, I
names
think-
of
I will
God?
withdraw my use of a biblical term.
But if
And-
I have understood this correctly, what you're saying is from whenever we call ourselves a civilization, there has been generally a narrative of the earth and man being created.
Much
course.
before that,
Yeah,
there
of
has
course.
been
Yeah,
a narrative.
whenever. So
Since
that is what we are
humans
talking about.
have appeared on this planet, there has been the narrative of mankind being one with nature and the whole of nature being a creation of a divine power, entity, spirit, whatever you call it.
And what about the pagan societies?
All society, who do you call pagan? Now, you're using a Eurocentric word.
No,
yeah.
there is a pagan. No,
No, but
there is a
pagan-
deviation. There is a deviation. I believe that since the creation of the earth, since Adam alayhi salam was created, the belief, the faith in one God has been created with Adam. So I don't have any second
sorry
thought
to
about
differ.
that. Yeah.
I think
The
we deviated
belief-
from
But
modern
there
architecture
has,
completely.
but there has been deviations. But I guess what we would be beneficial for the audience to understand that what we are defining as traditional, it's our conception of this romantic idea of the creations of the past, which ceased to exist with the arrival of the modernist project. And to comment on Bedisha's account when she said she kind of made the modern equals the contemporary. So being contemporary is like you eloquently described, that you are serving the time and the place and the people of now versus tomorrow or yesterday. But the modernist project is an ideological project. So we have to understand that it's not about being contemporary. It's about ideology that was focused on selling a project systematically. It was introduced systematically through architects. For example, in Syria, Ekoshar and Michel Ekoshar and the Greek architect Dioxonakis or something, I don't know.
Dixodis.
But yeah, so these architects arrived with the corporate agenda. For example, the Ford Foundation had introduced cars to this part of the world throughout urban planning, and our cities were reshaped in order to create a sense of control as well. So the old cities, for example, the old cities of Damascus or Homs or Aleppo were completely reshaped by those French architects who decided that the urban fabric should be thinned out, that the monuments should be located, that the mosques should be cleared out around them. So you have this penetration of dominance over the societies.
Okay.
So the modern modern had to present a facade of appeal like any product, and that's how we ended up with buildings having facades of glass and stainless steel and all of that, and redefinition of progress. But what I have problem, but just to wrap up with this,
please take your time.
what I have problem with is the utilitarian conception that arrived with this, with this shift in the mindset of societies, that you are here just to consume and replace. And this is reflected in your buildings as well. So you have no attachments whatsoever to the product of because it became called a product. You have no attachment with this product because it doesn't belong to you anymore. And it has no active relation, or connection with you as a place. And this is the concept that now, modern architecture has been announced dead in 1998, so by the Athens Charter. So modern architecture had died, unfortunately, to some. But I mean, the continuation of the modernist project is that you have to have to bring to the market something else to sell with other labels, other tags like sustainability now, with green buildings and LEEDs and all of those labels, in order to continue to sell the product of modernism.
I'm going to let you respond, but really quickly, because I know you're chomping at the bit. She's saying that it's a modernist project, that it's ideological. But what about traditional architecture? Is that not ideological as well? Who gets to define tradition?
No, yeah, I think that if we do things, we always have to have ideas, and we have to have a theory in some way. So I think it's almost impossible to do something which is not ideological. But I know that when we talk, I think when Marva says the ideological is that it's like an hyper ideologization, which in some way abstract issues like, comfort, beauty, and also I think it's really, what you're talking about is the commodification, a culture of commodification, which is kind of really very broad and very kind of powerful. I have problems so with you because I'm a little bit, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with this, a little bit fatalistic. It's like really just there's this kind of diabolic machinery, and everything is just kind of targeting in the same direction, which actually leaves you very little hope, because humans have always been like that. They've always had self-interest, and so that's also why I believe, in what you say, and also what you say, that there's always an ideal, because architecture is always a pursuit of an ideal, of building a better world. And people use different ways of doing it. And also, I don't think that people say that modernism failed. I think it's just that often it has led to dead ends, and it has led to places, and it has destroyed places, and it has but also I think when you again looking at history, we also know that a lot of the things which happened is a reaction of things which happened before. So so you say this destroyed that, but then you look why this arise, because already something was kind of rotten before. What drives architecture? And I think we have to talk about vernacular versus high architecture, because you were also alluding to that. The high architecture, which is which kind of requires a lot of reading, study, literature, references, and then there's the day-to-day architecture, which has been practiced in pre-agrarian and post-agrarian society naturally without architects. And it has with natural materials, all by hand, and so on. And this kind of balance has been destroyed, and I think that's maybe something we have to talk about.
I have to let you respond, please.
Well, that's a lot of different
Yes.
points. But, to your point, Lucia, I mean, if you function in the UK up to a certain extent, you don't need an architect. You can build your own house. However, it is driven largely by the fact that, for example, a place like London, it really likes its, the heritage and the building. And we can discuss about whether or not that is really sustainable, holding on to that. But I think one of the things as a culmination, because we've jumped around a few things, what I would point out, and I think perhaps is worth debating, is what we call vernacular, traditional, or the talk about these kind of cities. They evolved because there was incremental building. And one of the things which happened with the onset of modernism, or what we call modern architecture, is we are expected to know the whole picture right at the beginning. And we have the tools now. And I mean, obviously my practice and as a Hadid architects where we work, we are on the forefront of using digital tools, and it is not scary, and it is still another tool. The pen is a tool and AI is a tool. But what I think, listening to all of this, perhaps we are missing is the fact that on day one now, if I were to put in a planning application for a building, I am expected to know absolutely how it is going to age, what it's going to look like 50 years from now. So there is a lot of future guessing which is happening, which perhaps because in the traditional kind of repertoire or in the vernacular, you were allowed to correct the mistakes as you're going along, which currently does not exist. And perhaps that's the bigger discussion which has to happen, because then you can tailor it, because society is changing very rapidly. Actually, we are not going to look at 100 years of change. We are changing. I mean, the biggest concern probably everyone has is we're going to turn into some kind of digital panopticon, right? It's Jeremy Bentham's finally going to see it happen. So the concerns are different, and our social structure and how we define community, whether it is local, whether it is, I think there's a lot of cross-pollination. The world is much smaller now, and we should learn from history, but I don't think we necessarily have a doomsday situation.
But how do you respond to the accusation that modern architecture removes that connection to the transcendent, to the divine?
I disagree with that, because as I was saying, that at the moment we are all identifying as the onset of modern architecture, which was 19th century industrialization, you suddenly had a lot of different tools. And yes, glass came into being, steel came into place, eventually injection molding came into place. So there were all these different tools. Now, the tools or the material changes should not necessarily take away from the value add of the space that you're creating. And I would say, perhaps that's controversial, but I would say that it's not modern architecture which has done away or flattened social structure or hierarchy. Yes, what it has done is given it a more universal kind of flavor. You do have the standardization. If you walk into a hotel chain here, or you go to Delhi, or you come here, or you go in Doha, or you go to, I don't know, Paris, they all look the same. So those things, yes, there's a big commodification, commercialization, but the onset of how it all started, I don't think it was an evil agenda.
But it is historically documented. I mean, it's something that we are looking at in retrospect. We're not, guessing around this thing. But we know the names of the architects. We know the names of the companies. We know the dates of that. We know the agendas of that. It's all documented.
But it was a utopian agenda of trying to fix well, that's a point of view.
No, because you can look at the immediate effect of that. First and foremost, I mean the control, the hegemony, the fragmentation, and then you can move few decades ahead, as you see now, the alienation and the segregation and this epidemic of loneliness that the modern architecture has created. It's
how? Tell me how.
Because you have now cities that only have a price tag for it. Wherever you walk, you have a price tag for it, and you have these neighborhoods where they are built based on class or background, or also economic background, and they are pushed away from sight. And you have those so-called historic centers in the European city, for example. They become like a touristic attraction and for international office buildings and so on. So there are no people in those places, even if they looked nice, even if they had the certifications of how well built and well thought of, but they do not bring societies in. They do not. They are not accessible, but also not approachable. Mm-hmm. And this is a problem that even traditional architecture is dealing with today, because it kind of presented itself as a pastiche, as something that is also catered for the taste of the travelers and the tourists coming to those cities. And one thing we have to understand now, that the architects play a major role here by becoming this middleman between the power, between the political power and the economic power. And it's all about the architect now. We have star architects for the first time, I guess, in history. You have these egocentric buildings where they are sold with the trademark of this star architect, and they take over the place and the space as if they are some kind of spaceship landed on the places.
Like iconic buildings, you mean? But I'm just wondering. I'm going to come to you, but I want to know, why can't modern architecture be unifying? You're talking about you go anywhere in the world and you can have some kind of uniformity in what to expect in a building. So on the flip side, can it be unifying in a globalized world?
Well, all of this discussion, a very important question you've been asking, and we haven't really responded to that. What is the narrative in modern architecture? And there is a narrative. And this is why I was tracing it back in history. When did this come about? You're right. Modernism is a word which has two kinds of meanings. One is a purely temporal sense of modern being of this present moment as opposed to the past and the future.
Contemporary.
But there is a moment where this term, modernism, takes on a different meaning. It represents a particular worldview. And that worldview I'm hearing reflected right here around the table, which is coming from the modernist narrative. Architecture has always been about building a better world. Since when was that the narrative? This is part of the modernist project.
It's a secular worldview, by the way. The modern worldview is a secular worldview. It's about globalization and individualism and so-called democracy, but it's just, it's a selling point.
The idea of today is better than yesterday. We're going to build a better world. Only there are certain uncomfortable things we must.
What do we mean by better world?
You use that term.
Oh, yes, a better word. Yeah.
So,
okay.
No,
Any issue with having that?
You go for it.
No,
You're going to thump the table now.
I mean, let me tell you, I really love you, Mama. I love this passion, and I agree with all the things you say. One thing is, you say it with, you have also really good arguments. You are well informed. I think maybe you kind of play, you play it really kind of strong, which I like.
We
also.
are here for debate.
No, I like that. One thing I would say, what you touch upon is really this idea, and this is not really architecture, and I agree also when you say architecture, it's used as architects, I mean, they are kind of used to sell the kind of ideology. But often when we make this kind of general statements, we also often underestimate also the part of idealism, which is still around when you talk about that. So, I mean, I know like modernist architects who really have great, humanist ambitions, and then sometimes they kind of obviously become victim of ideology, but sometimes they kind of try to bring out, to improve a way kind of, as you said, there's a kind of conditions, there's kind of a situation, and they kind of try to work, and it's very difficult, and sometimes heroic, and sometimes sometimes it's kind of tragical because they fail. But it's not because they want to fail, it's because it's so difficult. Something I want to kind of address is this idea of the monofunctional city, which you were kind of the suburbanization, the sprawling, the monofunctional city, which leads to fragmentation of the society, And it's not only the social divisions, it's every division. It's just the school is here, the offices are here, the airport is here. So everything is kind of just...
The Muslim is here, the Christian is
Yeah,
here.
exactly. So you have this... and I think that's really a really, really important problem. And it's something I know that in America, there's the new urbanism. They try to tackle it. And you're also right when you say that now, even with sustainability, green architecture, new urbanism, it's still always, because the system always able to really absorb it and just build it again in a commercial commodification. So, and we know about that. So that's something we have to constantly kind of address. But I think that's why I think tradition is not the past. Tradition means handing over. It means the tradition is really as much looking into the future of building. When I say building a better world, means building a world where people can live comfortably, they can be enjoying their places, they are safe places. You know that I think Aristotle said cities are places where people can live in freedom. So the idea of freedom and the idea of safety have been a really crucial.
I'm sorry, I can't help this. Aristotle said this about cities in which the majority were slaves.
It's true.
That's
Well,
true.
Edmund Burke said that we society is this contract between between us and between the unborn and the dead, and so this intergeneration contract between those who haven't been born and those who pass away, and with us here, it's all about it's human society is built around this idea of settlement, that you have in mind consideration of those who will become after you and those who came before you. And we are in a moment of time due to modernity that we only think about ourselves. We think about our own survival. Even when we discuss climate change, or we discuss, labor crisis and housing crisis and all the crises that riddle actually our global. Our globe, it's just we think about them in terms of our own survival. As people are now with people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are introducing other planets for that kind of survival. So I guess the modern approach to societies is to blame for this, because it had created a place where you only look at your own survival, you only think in functional means, you only think about, how to utilize the place around you.
So, Badisha, loss of the collective, loss of or breakdown of community. How do you respond to that?
If I can, yes, I'll come in. And I'll come in with a personal experience, right? London, big metropolitan city, fast-paced life. Everybody thinks that it's an extremely commodified city. However, there are multiple different communities which exist there. And one such community, we built a school. And this was a school which actually brought communities together. And it was a huge exercise, and coming from a star architectural firm, it was actually an exercise where we played down that we were involved in it, because you get a lot of criticism, because the assumption is if you have been vocal and you have thought beyond the obvious, that you are extremely selfish, right? That you do not care about the community. You do not care about how hope is being reintroduced through architecture. And I take exception to that, because that's a very, very broad generalization of a extremely wide practice. And I have personally delivered, and we won numerous awards for that, is a school in a borough where there was no school. It had the third highest crime rate in London at that point in time. It brought communities together. So the assumption that anything to do with this era that we are talking about, because I still say that modernism is a philosophical point of view. It was a movement. Modern architecture has moved on from it. And I will make that break. It's, we keep trying to pull it back into that. So if today's architecture is not modern architecture, what is it?
It's a
When
failure.
I think thank you
for
thanks for Bidesh, raising that point. Actually, we're talking about still You can't help it. It's sort of built into you. We're talking from the modernist perspective, and you're right. We've moved on. We've moved on to. We've moved on to that. We're now in a post-industrial, postmodern era, and the narrative has changed. We must recognize that. I keep coming back to this idea that there are distinct, precise, measurable, quantifiable moments at which the changes have occurred globally, not all at once in the same, all over the place. It has, as I said, the agrarian revolution, you can spread it to about 5, 6, and in many places it's still, pre-agrarian societies are still around. So, but broadly speaking, there is that shift, and there is a moment, and which is precisely connected with the industrial modes of production. Is you can date modernism from that. The idea, this world view of we're going to build a better, and modernism still was an idealism because it believed in universal truths. Yes, there were Newtonian universal laws of nature.
But it was also a colonial project.
It was, of course it was, but colonialism itself was an outcome and a fulfillment of the capitalist modernist project.
Yeah.
But what happens when you've conquered the whole world?
You exploit the riches of the whole world, and you make sure that the people will be busy trying to survive all the time, so they do not have any means of revolting over you.
From the narrative of fulfilling the needs of humanity.
Yeah, we agree that this is the moment in the aftermath of the Great Wars. We agree totally about that.
What the narrative changed.
Of course, the
from
worldview was
need to desire.
Of course.
Yes?
Yeah.
So all of this postmodernism, pluralism, relativism, there is no absolute truth, your right is... This is not modernism, this is postmodernism. And yes, it's a different construct.
Well, postmodernism was about electing from, trying to reconciliate what we are debating now, trying to make a patchwork of the traditionalist elements and patching that on the surface of the
Can I just intervene? I'm actually really fascinated. What would your present a scenario where you think that we have done the right thing?
We have done the right. We haven't.
No, present a scenario, because we are talking about the fact that architecture.
That was not the right question to ask.
Architecture works on the idea that you continue to create a better world. You're saying that we have failed to do so. I'm really interested in what would be your ideal scenario.
Well, I think the premise is kind of here confusing, because it is the modernist project is a project that came in the aftermath of a war, like we've been saying now for a long time, and that was a moment to establish the aftermath also of the legacy of the colonial powers who were retrieving themselves and retrieving their forces from places like the Muslim world and Africa and all over the world. So they made sure, by creating those systems as an extension to them, whether political or architectural or economic, they made sure that through the built environment that they have this legacy maintained in order for these interests to survive. So you're asking me what is the replacement or alternative to colonization? Of course, it's freedom. And
no, give me an architectural scenario where, because I think we have, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but we really have heard about the objection.
No,
you're not. I think architecture of meaning is what I'm advocating here and highlighting here, and it's a moment of history that, as much as the collapse happened, it also happened throughout the history that you reach an architecture of meaning where a reconciliation between the spiritual worldview happened with the ruling power, so the power system. And when you have these two systems working in harmony, you have a space for art to thrive, and you have a space for people to respond to through their art and architecture, and to address ontological and existential questions that we cease to have any room to ask because of modernist approach.
Marwa, in a place like Gaza or Syria, devastated by war, in a place like Gaza, a lot of the population is disabled. How do you begin to approach reconstruction of these places?
Of course, assuming that Gaza will be free, inshallah, that there is no colonization or Zionist approach to it, or Trump dream to remorph it as a Riviera, it will be built through the freedom that the people have. You have, for example, in Gaza, although it's a colonized stripe of land, you have the beaches belonging to their people. You have the spaces inhabited by the people, despite all the difficulties and the challenges which someone like me wouldn't dare to describe as an outlooker. You still have the ownership of place, because you do not have an agenda to colonize your space throughout architecture. I mean, the example of the project that proposed by Trump is very glaring. I mean, you have this developer and slash president who looks at space as attractive land. So they abolish any sense that people have any attachment to this place, any history, memory, imagination, and most importantly, any relationships among each other. So you have no neighbors, you have no connections with the corner of place, with a tree that was built here, with the shape of a beach, and all of that will be abolished, and it will be conceptual to the mind of the developer, or even sometimes to modernists. Whereas the people, where you can build a place of meaning, that you will have this room of freedom to respond. Architecture is about, like Dr. Kamel was talking about art. What is art? Art is this room of freedom to express yourself, to respond to the universe, to respond to something that is beyond yourself.
So can I
just
quickly jump into
yes,
one?
We'll go to Lucian.
Just to get the scenario right, for example, I know, like, when we're talking about large-scale public housing within contemporary cities, public housing is seen as a diminishing asset, right? Not something which is going to... So we need to change that narrative. I mean, there was an interesting housing project which was done, I think, in Chile by Alejandro Aravena's office, which actually is very similar to what you're saying, where part of the structure was built and then parts of it was left for an incremental increase as people habited it. And what it did do was, if you were giving them a structure with a one bedroom and you came and you added your second and third bedroom how you needed to within planning guidelines, it then basically gave that property more value because you started with a one bed. So perhaps when we are talking about the fact, because it is, again, a very idealistic scenario where you just leave it to the choice of people to come and create something organically.
Well, I'm not saying that. I have to comment afterwards, but I'm not saying that you have to be anti-architect. I am not saying that you need a space that, like with the Avera project, that you leave like gaps in the system for people to fill.
No, it's not anti-architecture. I mean, you still use architects for that. What I'm saying is, in terms of the fluidity of how this is happening, is what I'm hearing. I mean, maybe I've misunderstood it.
I'm talking about the role of art. It's when you like I said, it's a reconciliation between power and spirituality. It's a worldview where you are allowed to think about things that are beyond yourself, beyond your immediate needs.
But shelter is a very immediate need, and I think that's what we were discussing.
But
previously.
Shelter is different from home.
I'd love to hear how you define art as well.
Yeah.
But Lucian, please.
Yeah. I think, really, Marva, I love everything you say, and I really like your passion. Something I would just say, imagine, I'm really interested in this idea of reconstruction, post-war reconstruction. I did a project in Aleppo with my students. But what I kind of miss a little bit, because I think you're really in a poetical, you also in an ideological round here, because what you kind of presenting is a vision. It's very philosophical, ideological, but I don't see really like the kind of mission statement for. Imagine you have like
The tools, you mean?
Yeah, no, just the how would I say, the typologies, the morphologies, the meta, the stuff, the building types, because if you kind of go and you have Sahadis or Leon Krier and you kind of just make this statement, it's not giving really kind of a vision.
Neither of them offer any solutions to the architectural
No, I
landscape,
think,
in my humble view.
Yeah, no, but I think what we have to come up with, and that's why I think we have to come up with a plan where we know what happens from the beginning to the end. And it doesn't mean that everything has to be done at the same time. So, but it has to have and it has to relate to an existing culture, not to like spiritual and stuff. It has to relate to a material, organic, historical culture.
What do you mean by plan? Like an urban plan?
Yeah, I think we need a master plan. We need like.
But that's a modernist. But that's a modernist mindset
but how are you
as
going
well.
to build? How are you going to build
But
without?
the comprehensive, the comprehensive.
Who's going to build it? How are people understanding what to do? There's no guidance. If you don't have a plan is not modernist. Plan have always been done. You have always had.
I have trouble with the word comprehensive, not the plan. The plan is perfect, but I mean the word is comprehensive.
I didn't say comprehensive.
You said.
No. I said that you have to have a plan in terms of, if I've understood you correctly, which lays out the various phases, so that, but as we were saying, with the ability to modify and adjust as it happens.
That's what master plans have. They lay out the vision, they lay out the structure, and then over time, anyway, because over time, let's say 50 years, and then things change, and there are kind of adjustments. But urban building reconstructions, they mostly follow a very, very simple, you need a framework, you need an armature, you need typologies, you refer them back to the culture. But can I just say just one last thing, because I'm stopping there because I don't want to offend you.
I have
a feeling she's not easily offendable. But
yeah, no. I just want to say something about star architecture, and I'm not doing an apology, but what I always thought, if there is star architecture, it means that architecture is still relevant in this period of history. And if people kind of are so attracted, there's also the commodification, it's the image, it's the prestige, it's the kind of commercial and financial. But there's also fascination. There's a fascination with this idea of creating places, creating memorable places which really strike you.
Objects more than places, right?
No, it's also places.
I mean,
no, places are places.
They're also places.
And placemaking can be, yes, you can have a traditional point of view, you can have a vernacular expression, or you can have a contemporary expression. But the assumption that if you are someone who's coming from a modern architectural firm or classified as, we are branded as a star architect, that we do not understand placemaking is just not correct. And you can see that in a lot of public sector. And the thing is, a lot of star architects actually did come into play because there was a need as part of the, nation building projects, as we'll call, city regeneration. There was a huge focus on public buildings because we were living in a time where you're not making palaces to make a statement or large government buildings. You start, our ZHA's entire portfolio initially is made of museums where you come in and you're creating a regeneration for an entire city. I mean, we didn't do Bilbao, but the Bilbao effect is quite well known. So there is that one aspect. I am not saying that is all of architecture. And I very much think that there is, if you can talk about that, then you can can bring that same design expertise into something which is a public sector project, housing, schools. And I've done that. So I can say for sure, I know what I'm doing when I can talk about high architecture, but equally that same sensibility can be brought in to something which is meant for the people. I mean, the best projects for an architect is the ones where the maximum people can access and experience it.
Camille, do you agree with anything she said?
Well,
I'm genuinely curious.
I really admire all of your aspirations and hope and your belief that we can change the world, we can build a future world, or we can just remove the faults and so on. What I'm doing, I'll now just say from my point of view, I don't have a choice in this. What I'm doing, I have no other choice to do. What do I mean? Look, Pakistan is broke. It has no money. It is indebted more than generations will not be able to repay. Financially, we're kaput. Ecologically, my city has the worst air quality in the world. We compete with Delhi, sometimes Mexico, but we're right up there amongst the top 3 or 4 worst air qualities in the world. My river Ravi, is the most polluted with industrial pollution river in the world.
Whose fault is this?
Now, shall I try and find whose fault it is?
Not mine.
I'm trying to how do I build in this reality? So there is no choice. I cannot use industrial materials. That is what has broken our economy. That is what has polluted and destroyed our environment. It's not a choice. I have to stop using industrial materials. So then where do I learn how to use pre-industrial materials? I look to the masters. So these are not about tradition, Islam, nothing. And there's nothing else that one can do. So this is what I call perforce. We are being forced back to normality. We have strayed so far away from. Frankly, I don't see any coming back.
I mean, the materials. I mean,
I think
it's a matter of survival for Kamal. How would your
It's a matter
firm
of survival for
respond?
every country, the world. We have taken so much out of it, and it is not just the last 100 years which has done that. So it is an extremely relevant, because we are having these same conversations. When we start getting projects coming in, we have to tell the client, well, we take this really seriously and we cannot undo everything, but we're going to try to at least make a difference. Can we help and build with local materials? What we are finding as a challenge, and now we're talking very practical, is the scalability of traditional skill sets. Because what happens very frequently, and just due to the kind of projects we are involved with, when you're doing very large scale projects and you bring in, and we've really been trying to pull in traditional, we're doing a lot of work in the Middle East. So if you're talking about materials, stone, mud, skills, it's going to take time, and we're going to get there. And I think this is the right thing to do, is start looking at what was traditional wisdom and how you could use materials which were able to regenerate themselves. I think that is the right thing to do. Now, however, we are used to a certain, if I use concrete, I can use large-scale steel, I get columnless spaces. You're not going to have that. So we again have to rethink the typology of what a structural grid is going to look like. And that's okay. We've been reinventing ourselves over history anyway. So
would AI help with that? I mean, what do you think about AI?
It would help the destruction.
I will disagree with that, but let Camille finish.
What does AI allow us to do is super efficiency, super information processing. So what's the use of that? Oh, we can improve production.
Right?
Scalability, perhaps?
We'll do it much faster. So already we are being destroyed by overproduction. And
It will
AI will
increase
help
the-
us to destroy
decrease
ourselves much
intelligence.
faster.
I mean,
No, this is, again, artificial intelligence is exactly that. It's artificial. It is a
and
system.
it's not
and a-
intelligence. It just,
Yes, but
it will-
let's not take it literally. It's a tool that we do have. And I agree with the fact that it's seen. And, unfortunately, I think this post-pandemic where everybody thinks AI is the silly images that they're creating on their phone.
Yeah, how are we
No.
defining AI? I think that would be helpful.
Building informational modeling has been there for since 200 years almost. We can monitor comfort, we can give feedback, you can make design better. This intelligence, where you gather data, you understand what the implications were, and you can therefore come up with solutions which are more. And again, it's not a linear graph. It goes up and down. So the thing is, people are associating artificial intelligence with what you see in the social media, but that is not the case. When we talk about computational design, the ability to take a lot of variables which can be adapted to each other, exactly this, what we are talking about, rethinking how I would use timber and how can I, because we have also changed habits. It's not that I can just go back and create an extremely cellular space and people will be okay because, a traditional, we've done a lot of research on Nashti architecture, a traditional palm leaf branch will give me 3.5 meters.
But that's also, that's the result of utilitarian thinking. You just, there is no art in this. This reliability.
Why is there no art in it?
Because it's reliable on just answering simple questions. There are no big questions. There is no invitation to the imagination. There is no thinking about what kind of feeling this will become from this. There is no corresponding moral idea behind it. It just, answering very simple questions like a builder. It's not an art. Even a builder would have more, sense with the material, with, there is, if you talk to any craftsman or a buildman who would have this relationship with the material, will have something of a discussion or a dialogue with its material, whereas it's just so reliable.
Sorry, I'm going to stop you.
I didn't stop you.
Artificial intelligence, the way we are describing it currently, it is not something which has gone away and is doing my job. It is still a tool in my hands.
I know.
Where I am trying to understand when you have whether traditionally in construction, in design, in having a higher thought on an architectural project, there are variables, there are
Do you
constants.
believe that it can answer the ontological questions of art?
But first, as an architect, my larger vision is amazing, but I need to address. The idea that you can have a larger vision is great, but as an architect, the first thing you're doing is solving a problem which is very physical and spatial.
Yeah, but
and
you need your imagination for that. Not a technical tool to answer it.
But my imagination is for the ontological questions. I'm using artificial intelligence to answer the very factual, pragmatic variables which are required for construction. Why does one preclude the other? It doesn't have to.
I think we're conflating. In terms of design, would you take AI so far as to actually help you design a structure?
You use it for doing conceptual work, yes, but we use soft form modeling, which was originally used for animation.
Again,
Can I get
Different and for structural studies as well.
I want to know what you think about AI.
Yeah, AI. For me, it's too complicated. No, but something I have a problem with already, and that's why I'm not really getting a lot of emotional traction for AI, is that this idea, as I mentioned before, that building things you cannot really do with your hands and you cannot imagine, so they are unimaginable. And I know that, for example, you do this amazing project, which are absolutely fantastic, but I have students who can draw really, really beautiful, and they cannot, when they see, they cannot draw it, and I think that's really a problem where there's this kind of disconnection between our mind, our imagination, and the things we can do. And what I mean hand is not literally the hands, but it's like, because I understand that the computers is a tool and artificial intelligence can be used as a tool. Actually, I'm doing translation, I'm using artificial intelligence. to do but I'm doing the translation, so it's just helping
If you're writing
me.
a story, you won't be writing through.
No, I'm not
yeah.
trying. I'm not using it. So I'm just using it because it goes a little bit quicker, and I just edit it, and I can kind of fix it and everything, and it makes a difference because it just helps me. It's very practical. In terms of design, I saw that my students, they use all SketchUp and everything, which is like very, there's already artificial intelligence because they kind of start modeling 3D and then put it in every direction. But what I noticed that all of my students who start using the computer at the beginning, they're not getting really good designs. So the best designs are always started by hand and sketching and just with a kind of non-artificial intelligence. And then in the process, when you kind of develop it, then you bring in more sophisticated tools and maybe artificial intelligence. We are, at my school, we are discouraging students to use it.
And I think you have to have a balance.
Yeah.
It's not that you completely give away all cognitive or emotional connection to the design that you're creating by just handing it over to a program. However, once we have done enough and we kind of train our own intelligence models within the firm. So because we have a research team. So it's a slightly different perspective because it genuinely is a tool. But that does not mean that we don't make models. It doesn't mean that we don't sketch. When we are sitting and reviewing design, very frequently I'm like looking around and my team quickly comes with a paper and pen because we are still having that discussion. It doesn't preclude, it doesn't become one or the other or nothing and everything.
Changing gears a bit, Kamal, what role does beauty play in this conversation that we're having?
First of all, let me say, I really envy this panel that have the luxury to even discuss these things. For myself, I'm not so worried about the limitations of artificial intelligence. I'm scared if it succeeds. That's my horrible scenario. It will actually succeed and be more efficient and produce more. And that's, where is it going?
But why? Why does that scare you so much?
Because we are producing way beyond the means of this planet already. We are overshooting by 175% over and above the biocapacity of this planet. And Pakistan, you'd be surprised, is overshooting its biocapacity by 116%. So here comes a device which will help us to overshoot thousands of times faster.
But can't you use it the way you want to use it?
We won't be around to use it.
Oh, but the next generation will know how to use it more.
I hope there'll be a next generation.
But I think it's what I think really with you. So I think it really disempowers us. And when I hear about artificial intelligence, I see robots, soldiers doing war, and robot dogs with explosive devices, and spyware, which kind of creates genocide and things like that. And I think that's, unfortunately, the intelligence. That's kind of there's a kind of maybe a little peak of interesting, creative possibilities for people who have still decent ethics, but then it's kind of becomes a diabolical kind of tool in advanced capitalism, where it's kind of just really used to reinforce and enhance already kind of all the problematic aspect of our society.
So just about your question on beauty.
Yeah.
Oh, beauty, yeah, that's something.
I don't think beauty needs us to define what it is. Beauty is a universal reality, invariable. It cannot be defined, incidentally, because it is metaphysical. It's not physical, you can't measure it, much as modernism has tried to reduce it to scientific calculations. So beauty can only be defined by an observer, a subject that can experience it.
Well,
We're
some
all-
philosophers would disagree with this because I
I'm
mean,
sure a lot of people will disagree with that.
it's been I mean it's been the quest of many philosophers to
Yes.
define beauty,
Yes. But
and
you're right.
Yeah.
And some philosophers have said that beauty is truth and truth beauty. Poets have said that. And so many people have talked about beauty in such terms that comes from experiencing it.
Yeah. I mean,
You
in
don't
terms of
need a-
architecture, aesthetics perhaps is more of a definable term.
Aesthetics tends to be more sensorial, whereas
Exactly,
beauty is more about
Exactly.
truth.
I mean, as architects, we deal with the aesthetics as we imagine the experience and we recreate the experience for the user. So perhaps the issue of aesthetics of architecture, which is also the title of a late philosopher's book,
Is that like
Roger
Scruton?
Scruton. So he defined beauty based on Kant's view and other philosophers, but he wrote about the aesthetics of architecture in terms of the pleasure that you could create for the user, and also in terms of the moral thought that is that corresponds with the values that are behind the shape. So there are deeper meanings related to architecture.
Indeed,
And I guess
I agree with that.
It's the task of architecture
Yes.
is to bring to the fore those meanings.
Right.
I th-
And
yeah, I
it's
think-
just that beauty is a reality which is experienced by humans all over the world since time immemorial. Whether you can find some language for it, words for it, that's what we struggle with because it is ineffable.
Yeah.
I think, I know that, I agree with you. I think that we need to have a concept of beauty or a reflection on beauty as an artist or architects. But that is more like a meditation. What I tell people when they talk about, because they are classical architects, they kind of know, it's really, there's a congress in Oslo, they talk about beauty and ugliness. And there are people who are neuropsychologists, and they kind of develop now scientific analysis of beauty with eye movement and everything. And I think it's kind of really getting to a point where it reduces beauty to kind of mechanics.
Yeah, the next thing AI will define
Yeah,
beauty for you.
exactly. But I think that, and so I just like something, I always say, beauty is like love, or it's like war. You don't have to define it. You know what it is, and peace. You don't have to define peace because when you say peace, everyone knows what peace is. And love and beauty is the same thing.
Yeah.
Vidisha, what do you think?
For me, beauty, I agree. It's not something that you can quantify or express in words. It varies. The experience of it varies depending on who you are, your own upbringing, your own values. Someone's beautiful could be someone else's ugly. So it's not something that you can easily quantify, and I don't believe there's a universal beauty. Yes, I agree that, if you see something which is calm, peaceful, or gives you a serene experience, perhaps those are the qualities which are universal. But as a kind of set of features which is universal, I don't necessarily share that view. I think that's very subjective because it's very value-driven, your own kind of ethnicity, religion, everything else will form a basis for that judgment.
I disagree.
I too.
I disagree
I
with
too.
Yeah,
that.
I think
fine.
beauty is universal, but it cannot be defined. But it's universal because I think you accept that it's something you share because you can go, I'm here, it's not
Like
my
goodness.
culture.
It's related to
Yeah,
goodness.
Yes,
yeah. I understand what beauty is. I have an empathy what beauty is in the Islamic world or the Chinese or wherever I go. And I see that when I talk to people, we kind of share. We have like common, and it's as you say. Sometimes there are some buildings. I say, I like this less, but it's not that I would say some people see this is beautiful and this is ugly. I think then when that happens, that's already when we are in a cultural dissolution where the good taste and good manners have gone completely out of the world.
But would you agree with Kamil that beauty is truth?
Yeah, of course. As a classicist, it's goodness and truth. Yeah.
Well,
I'm not disagreeing with that, but for me,
But whose
it's not
truth?
something you can define universally. Whose truth is
Whose
it?
truth?
No, whose truth?
Yeah, this is postmodernism speaking.
Yeah, the truth doesn't belong to
There is
anybody.
no absolute truth.
The
It may be
truth-
good for you, it may be bad for me.
No, but truth
That's,
does not belong to
that's the
anybody. It's not
narrative.
property.
This is the postmodernist narrative. What can one say?
So you believe in an absolute truth, but you're saying it depends on whose truth.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
this is
yes.
contradictory. I mean,
Yeah, that's not. Yeah, that's contradictory. I think there's universal beauty, universal truth, and it's not, like when you say, when somebody says, politicians say, this is the true way to go. That's not truth. Truth means that a number of things in the world have been, in a way, they have always been, and they kind of have been real, and they have been truthful, and they resonate with our ethics. We know that we shouldn't kill people, we should respect our parents and everything. So there are a number of things which exist in every ethical system, which we consider to be true guides, and we also feel them deep in ourselves without necessarily having a lot of arguments.
But before we close, I just want to go around, and I'm really interested to hear, first with you, Marwa, what did you learn today from your co-panelists?
Well, I have to reflect on this. I mean, it's because this kind of experience is just you are so immersed in it, and in order to give a fair answer, I think it's a question to be reflected upon. But I think the main takeaway from this debate is that it reflects the floundering status of our times, where so many ideas are conflating with each other, and it also reflects the urgent need to pin down some of the subjects that had been fundamental to people for a long time, and now they seem to be, it moved from being obvious to being very conflicting and controversial.
Christian?
Yeah, first I have to say again, I really love passion and Marwa, she makes me think about Jean Giono. He says, the most important thing is to remain a cheerful pessimist. And I really, like you, I learned a lot. I learned a lot, and this various perspective. I really appreciate your wisdom and also the kind of moderation. Just finding the middle way, the balance. And I like you so much. I would like to know more about Zaha Hadid.
Thank you.
Zaha Hadid was one of my black, my Zaha Hadid and Daniel Libeskind were like one of the architects I never looked at, and I was, I was kind of forced to look at it because when you look at journals. But I really appreciate your kind of openness, and also I think we found a lot of common ground. Like talking about materials, about ways of approaching community. So that's, I think, very, very kind of admirable. I would say. For me overall, it was so positive.
Kamel?
Well, I think this for me has been a very enlightening discussion. It has made me more acutely aware of the strength of the prevailing paradigms that are so tightly caught our minds and hearts and so on. And but through it, I'm also encouraged to recognize a deep goodness, a genuine, honest goodness, which is not, recognizes there's something more powerful and worthy to strive for than what the circumstances are making us. And I'm especially encouraged. There are individuals who can stand apart from this deluge and get a larger picture. So I'm strengthened and heartened and hopeful and glad to have had this conversation, and find there is so much grounds for us to interact and find the best way forward. Yeah.
Final word, Badisha.
Well, no pressure then. But I think I would extend what Kamal said in the sense that I really appreciate the fact that we can still have such robust conversations. And of course, we have come from diametrically opposing views, perhaps. And perhaps we started the conversation with, has modern architecture lost its relevance? I don't know. However, what I see is that architecture has not lost its relevance. We still have a lot of building to be done. And it's good to have these kind of opposing conversations, because I think when we push against each other, some of the best projects have happened when we've come with an idea and someone has come back and pushed hard against it, because then you really have to make sure that that idea is robust and will stand the test of time or the function. And this kind of a conversation or this kind of a platform, I think that's the most encouraging part, is we can continue to have a conversation.
I have to say, all of you have given me a deeper appreciation for architecture, and hopefully for our audience as well. Really fascinating stuff. Thank you so much. It's really been an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure was ours.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this conversation and want to see more, subscribe to the Doha Debates YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any future episodes.